15 or 16 months working.
¿Qué es lo que has visto que hay diferencia entre trabajar aquí como artista que en tu ciudad?
Wish everything. There's less of an infrastructure for artists here. So everything's much more like self-made and self-promoted, which I really like about it. There's less support systems. There's less galleries. There's less alternative spaces. There's less of kind of like an institutional quality. It's a lot more kind of like freewheeling, and that's good and bad. I think, well, as a result of less of a kind of establishment or a support structure or an infrastructure, there's a tremendous freedom for artists to work here that doesn't exist in New York, for example, which is that you can kind of make whatever the fuck you want here, and you can put together any projects that you want, and it doesn't feel like there's as much pressure or as many eyes watching.
¿Qué más?
And in that sense, like, it really feels free because you're kind of just here doing your own thing. And if you want people to know about it, you can tell them. We have the internet to tell people, no? And if you don't, you don't. But it's just, there's less like weight and baggage that you're dealing with as an artist. You can kind of explore whatever avenues you want.
Por ejemplo, ahí, ¿qué diferencia tienes como artista? Que ahorita que estás diciendo que tienes el acceso ya a sacarlo por red.
Mm-hmm.
Pero ahí cambian las cosas, o sea, ya no es lo mismo ver la obra en una imagen que verla en físico.
Of course not.
Por ejemplo, ahí, ¿qué tantas ventajas ves de poder de promocionar lo que son galerías de esa forma? De exponer las obras en galerías virtuales en vez de físicas.
What do I think the difference is between the two, or what is the advantage of ventanas, of course. What is the advantage of using the internet as opposed to expositions in a physical space?
Yeah.
Finding, well, first of all, the internet's been really important for me while I've been living here, because I come to Mexico with a different set of experience, a different stance on art, I think, than a lot of Mexican artists, and so it's been really hard to find peers here. And so using the internet has created an advantage of a community that I haven't necessarily satisfied physically in Mexico. Like, I feel very individual and almost alone here as an artist doing what I do. But through the window of the internet, I've been able to kind of like reach out and have support groups and kind of like a community that doesn't necessarily physically exist yet in Mexico.
Aquí en México, ¿cómo ves la interacción entre artistas? Hay demasiado la pose del blog de yo soy un gran artista porque expongo, o todos realmente tienen una idea de lo que están haciendo. Y por ejemplo, ¿y allá qué es lo que te pasaba lo mismo o si hay diferencias?
It seems to be, well, you know, social art is a much bigger deal here. Artists are a lot more humble and less arrogant here, I would say, than in more kind of like infrastructurally developed cities like New York. And so people seem to work together more. I feel like there's more collaboration happening here than in other cities, because it's less of kind of like an existential me against the world, which is a very like puritanical, it's a very like gringo thing. Like, I'm building my own empire by myself and no one's allowed to touch it, and I don't want to share my fame with anybody, and I'm going to do this by myself. Mexico has kind of like a different social dynamic where people work in groups more, I find.
Okay. ¿Crees que
we were talking about whether like the social community here helps artists, or it's kind of like an individual conquest-based thing, like it is in the United States.
Bueno, pero por ejemplo, ¿qué ventajas ves de trabajar en comunidad o trabajar por solitario?
Well, I find that it works well for me to do both. You know, I mean, because there's very different projects that you can do with oriented towards a community of artists than you can individually. And here it seems like there's so many collectives and like social groups congregating around art that are working together to do more like social based work. I really think that like it has a lot to do with the market for art and well, in New York the market is strong enough that you can kind of like be alone and have success, I guess. By that meaning you're selling your work and you're growing without the necessity to interact with other people, strangely enough. Here, I don't think the market really like has any play on what artists do, and so people kind of need to help each other.
Ok. En Nueva York ya tienes la idea de, o sea, la gente ya tiene la idea que si va a una galería puede comprar una obra
Ajá.
y que ese valor es una inversión.
Ajá.
Aquí en México no tenemos esa idea. O sea, porque nosotros aquí todavía tenemos tenemos la noción de que el arte tiene que ser algo maravilloso para comprarlo, para que sea una inversión. O sea, que tiene que ser algo grande, o sea, un cuadro grande.
Something valuable or historically important.
Exacto, pero no nos vamos mucho a artistas nuevos, a los que son emergentes, a los a lo mejor que tienen 5 o 10 años trabajando, porque no sabemos apreciar el valor de lo que están haciendo, aunque sea algo muy bueno. ¿Tú cómo lo ves teniendo las dos partes? O sea, en una que empezaste a hacer, donde ya hay una base, y llegar aquí a donde, como tú estás diciendo, todos aquí se apoyan entre varios para poder lograrlo, aunque les cuesta trabajo.
Well, it's a really difficult thing because things are supposed to be valuable if they are relevant, if they take into account history and they're pushing what history is forward into time. If they have some kind of like influence on the contemporary history, the history as it's being written right now, I think that's where the value of art comes in. And one of the things that I think the strength of the Mexican art scene has is that because there's less artists being pushed into the meat grinder of the gallery system and having their work be given this kind of like having their work be put into a value system that doesn't necessarily equate to anything, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, because they're showing with certain galleries, so that must mean that they're relevant because they're working with that gallery. We don't have that here in Mexico, so it's actually, I think, a strong suit. I mean, it's very frustrating as an artist not to be able to generate revenue on the work that you're making, but you're not distracted by a gallery putting your art into its system and then you feeling like you're competent or doing something contemporary. I think that ends up being like this very bureaucratic and political distraction from actually making art, for making pure art, for understanding what art is to you, and for building upon your ideas of art. I think that Mexican artists actually have an advantage, frankly, because they're not so distracted by the bureaucratic kind of financial system of art. It's like a grass is greener on the other side. I want to be living in a place like this that's so fucking free from the market. There's no market here. I've started making work that I don't think could possibly sell. I think it would be impossible to sell. But what's great about that is that like it's better because it's not restricted by making something that has to sell. And so I think that Mexican artists have a really big advantage, but of course also a disadvantage because you can't have one without the other. You know, like it's super hard to sustain yourself as an artist here. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty normal thing everywhere now. I mean, like if you work with a gallery, you're supposed to be receiving kind of like their support system, their contacts, and they're doing all this like administrative and PR work for you, and your exchange, and also it kind of like somehow values your work. It legitimizes that you're an artist because a gallery thinks that they can do business with what you're making, so they take 50%. But I also like I have done things in New York and in Brooklyn using my own spaces or renting spaces, and I think it's just as valuable. Problems?
Ajá.
Always.
Bueno, también considerando que tu obra es un poco más caótica,
Ajá.
sí vas a tener más problemas.
Oh, like that thing with Miles, kind of?
Ándale.
Okay. No, I haven't really had that happen because I make most of my contacts that I'm going to work with through the internet, and I'm so fucking loud and revolting on the internet that people know exactly what they're getting into when they work with me. You know what I mean? I mean, people see that I'm super passionate and I'm talking shit about art all of the time.
Ajá.
And so they're not surprised when my art is talking shit about art.
Ah, ok.
You know, it's not like I'm not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes, as they say. So they kind of know what they're getting into when they want to make an agreement with me.
Ok.
But that's a very common thing, and it's really sad, and it doesn't. One of like the weirdest things about the Mexican art scene is that it's not New York, and it's not Los Angeles, and it's not Berlin, and it's not London, and it's its own thing. And I wish it's kind of like it has the opportunity to be more raw, to be more honest, to take more risks. And it's frustrating, like with that situation that happened with Miles, when like this very kind of conservative washes out all of the strength of like what artists do in Mexico. Like we have an opportunity to take greater risks here than in other places because you're not losing anything. Like the spaces are way cheaper to rent. Life is cheaper to afford here in a funny way. So like when the infrastructure or the man doesn't want to take risks because they're playing like a different art, they're playing the games given to them by a different art landscape that isn't the Mexico City landscape. It's really stupid and frustrating and undermines exactly what we can do here and what the strength of this place is, which is that you can be as volatile as you want.
Por ejemplo, es que no quieren tomar riesgos, exacto.
Will they start taking risks, basically, is what you mean?
Exacto.
Man, that has everything to do with kind of like getting a new population, attention, circulation into the museums. You know that like every presidential change that happens in Mexico, the museum directors just like switch into other museums. So it's like the same directors all of the time. There's no new blood coming in, and at the end of the day, they want to satisfy the patrons that are like giving money to the foundations for the museums. And the same with these galleries, like all of these bullshit big galleries in Mexico that don't really care about art and they only care about business, and I get that because that's what a gallery is, but like no risk taking it at all. It's really like sad and pathetic, and like we keep having like these minimalism shows from 40 years ago because like the rich old men want to buy minimalism for their minimalist collections that they found out about when they were 40 and started making money, and now they're 80 and they still want to buy the same shit, so they still show the same shit. And there's just a tremendous wealth of artists here that are working that don't get any attention, that don't have any vehicle to discuss, that aren't given any platform to work from, because all of the kind of like big systems for promoting artists, which are museums and galleries, are grandfathered into like these super old ideas, because at the end of the day it's about their bottom line, and it's not about like a passion for pushing art forward. It's about making money off of like already existing ideas.
Okay. Bueno, pero también, por ejemplo, o sea, tú como artista tienes que comer. Entonces, de tus obras tienes que sacar el dinero para poder...
Pues ojalá.
Exacto. Esa es la idea, o sea, ojalá que se pueda. Pero ¿qué es lo que pasa? Volvemos a lo mismo. Todos lo empiezan a centralizar. Tú como artista, ¿ves el arte como arte o el arte como negocio?
Like art.
O sea, arte.
And I think that if you see art as a business, you're either lying to yourself or you're fucked. You know, and there's a lot of like ironic young artists coming out that are like have these kind of like business oriented personas that talk about themselves as business people instead of artists. I think they're really like limiting what they can do with art, and I think it's like a bullshit trend. Yeah, everybody says that with art you have to eat, and so you have to settle for something eventually, but really like what happens, because art is like a blue chip stock. Art is not like something that you can invest in today and tomorrow you'll get a return. Art is something that you have to use your instinct to invest in, your brain to invest in, and buy something that you think is going to have an impact 40 years down the road in a funny way. And I see a lot of people that are my age like coming to this place where they're tired of having been poor for their whole life, and so they start making what they know is going to sell. And I think every good artist knows what is going to sell, and we make a choice either to make something not or something that is that. Like something that follows suit with what I know that like this Mire from Polanco will definitely buy to hang above his couch. Like I know what that fucker's gonna buy for sure. But what's much more important to me is making something new that he won't buy, that maybe in 20 years he'll realize he was an idiot for not buying. Or making something that will convince him to buy. Or making something that affects all the other artists around me. And so many people are being affected by it that eventually it has to gain market value. But like making something that has market value right now because I know I could sell it seems to be like the ultimate sellout and the ultimate glass ceiling, the ultimate closing of the door on your opportunity to kind of like move forward and push art somewhere.
Exacto. Ok, entonces tú estás a favor de hacer la ruptura del arte. O sea, ya lo que tú me decías, ¿no? Que en Nueva York ya todos empiezan a hacer el arte que es vendible. O sea, no hay una ruptura tal cual en nuevas obras, en técnicas.
Well, the only people that aren't making art that's sellable are like people whose family is giving them money, and like that's awesome, and I can't complain about that. That's part of life, you know. Like those are the people that I'm frankly competing against right now. Are like people that don't have to have a job, that don't have to sell anything, and so they can like kind of make jokes about art and do whatever they want. And I think that's cool. I don't think that like art has to be taken so seriously or you have to have a really hard life to make good art or any of that, but I would rather earn my own success. Okay. And unfortunately and fortunately that's the condition that I'm in, and I like it. I think that if I didn't have to work, if I think that I didn't have to make good ideas that could sell, if I didn't have to generate income to maintain myself as an artist, I would probably be a much worse artist, and I'd probably also not have the intensity that I have, like the desire, the necessity that I have. So I'm very thankful that I have not been given anything and that I'll earn whatever I can. But it's also funny because now that I'm living in this place that doesn't have a market, like I said, I've kind of like been working on all this new shit that's impossible to sell, knowing that it's not going to sell anyway. Like I had a painting show a couple of months ago that I thought were like really good paintings. I'm still super satisfied with them. And like there's just no market to support that here. So what's the point of like making really valuable objects if you can't sell them anyway? You might as well kind of like cut all that bullshit of making objects for the market away and like start dealing with what art actually is, which doesn't have to be an object to be sold.
Ok, por ejemplo, una de las broncas son con los curadores. O sea, porque el mismo curador dice, es que esto no va a ser vendible. Ellos están cerrando el mercado del arte o tratan de expandirlo.
They just want to make the world like believe in their vision, whatever their vision is. I don't know that they're necessarily, I mean, it just depends on whether they're good or they're bad or what they want out of curation. You know, it's like, it's not one thing. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. No, how could they possibly be trying to, their life revolves around art. I don't see how they would want to close the market down.
Okay. Igual, bueno, tomando todavía a los curadores, ¿con ellos has tenido problemas de la percepción de la obra? O sea, que tú digas, mi obra es esto, o sea, es la destrucción como la de los libros que tienes, que es destrucción total de los libros. O sea, tú le dices a alguien, ¿sabes qué? Acabo de hacer un montaje de puros libros que destruí, perforé, maltraté, etcétera, etcétera. Y mucha gente va a decir, ¿pero por qué haces eso? O sea, el libro ya en sí es una obra.
I guess.
Entonces tú lo que estás tomando es esa obra para hacerla de nuevo.
You're out of batteries.
Ok. Bueno. Tú tienes tus obras de libros que son destrucción, etcétera. ¿Has tenido bronca con algún curador o con algún espectador que te diga que no le agrade lo que está viendo, de lo que tú has hecho?
No. I haven't really heard anything about it. Whoops. I haven't really gotten any kind of feedback on those, you know? So nobody's had a problem with it, but there's also like this, I mean, just like there's a bunch of like shitty artists and a lot of people like working through ideas to try to get to a place that they're not at now. There's a lot of curators that are in that same position, and like most of the curators that I see are people that want to be surrounded in the culture of art but don't really necessarily have a vision for what they want to say through curation, and so they're just like getting all of their friends that are artists to put whatever in a show. And like curation, I think, has just as much if not more responsibility to art than artists do. Like artists work as hard as they can to kind of like push the definitions of what can be art, what can't be art, pushing kind of like historical baggage forward, etc. But curators like are supposed to really know their shit and are supposed to be researching the artists that they're involved with and selecting works that have a conversation together. And I haven't really been seeing very much of that here. I mean, it has to do with like the development and that we're kind of at this like very beginning stage of the culture unfurling here. So there are people that haven't necessarily like developed all of the way to their full working potential as curators. The same with artists, the same with galleries, the same with museums, and that's where all these kind of like entry level problems come in.
Otra. Ahorita que estás diciendo todo eso, que el curador es el que está escogiendo, que tengan la misma temática, que tengan el mismo discurso, etcétera, etcétera. ¿Has notado un estancamiento, por ejemplo, que ahorita muchos artistas quieren hacer instalaciones? O sea, que todos se quieren enfocar en hacer instalación, instalación, instalación. O sea, que el 80% de lo que ves es una instalación tal cual, pero no hay un gran cambio en ellas. O sea, lo que puedes ver hoy en una galería, la viste hace 3 años en la misma galería.
Mm-hmm.
O sea, no hay un cambio de idea. O sea,
well, the galleries aren't pushing anything here. They want to stay. They have a relationship with buyers that want to buy a certain thing, and the galleries want to give the product to the buyers that have expectations of the galleries. You know what I mean? So like, it's not like artists are kind of making new gestures and magnifying them through the galleries. It happens the other way around. Like the galleries are giving parameters for the artist to work in, and the artists are making things inside of the parameter of the vision of the gallery, and the gallery is trying to sell the things inside of those parameters that they've sold before to certain buyers that want to buy just those things.
Ok. ¿Qué más?
That's where like having independent spaces and auxiliary spaces and project spaces comes in. That's really important because having independent spaces and project spaces grants a freedom to the space and to the artist to kind of like push whatever gestures they want into the public. And yes, it's nice to receive financial feedback. Yes, it's nice to sell things so that you can sustain your activities. But like the bigger picture is like putting new gestures into the landscape, and that's not really happening very much.
Ok. ¿Qué más?
So like the big artists are the big artists. They're on the top of the mountain. They don't want to move from the top of the mountain, so they're going to stay there. So they're kind of like established for what they do, and they're going to stay doing that thing. The galleries kind of all work the same way, and like I think that a lot of the young artists coming out of the schools, I'm really curious about these kind of like young generations of artists that are coming out of these art schools in Mexico, because there's like a real conflict between keeping this kind of like romantic, anarchistic Mexican artist mentality alive, which is like working in opposition to the man, which basically means working in opposition to kind of like the international like art mechanism, and doing new things. And so a lot of like the changes that I'm seeing are that there's a lot of like foreigners, I think much more foreigners, starting to come to Mexico and realize like this is the fucking promised land. Like it is so cheap to produce art here. It's so cheap and like wonderful to live here. The people are so nice. Like there's beauty everywhere. There's so much stimulation to work with. There's so much like gravitas to be dealing with as far as like the political situation contemporarily and historically. Like there's so much intellectual material and data to be working with here. But a lot of like the younger Mexican artists still kind of like seem to be unsure whether they want to like throw themselves into the art mechanism and start trying to like be working internationally and turn into big artists and thus kind of like undercut their romantic like the Daniel Guzman image or whether they want to like start contributing to the conversation at large, which is like the international conversation. I think the internet's going to make really, really big changes over the next 10 years. I think that Mexico already has a spotlight that it might not have had 10 years ago, and it's just going to keep increasing. I have so many friends from around the world that are like super curious about what it's like to be an artist in Mexico, and that are coming to find out. And I think like injecting all of these new ideas into the space and getting things working in between the established conversation is a really good way to kind of like push things forward.
Ok, entonces, ¿tienes la idea que en algún momento, o sea, ya cercano, México va a ser catalogado como un gran punto del arte?
Yes, definitely. The conditions are perfect. There's nothing to stop it, frankly. It's got so many people. There's a very deep and vast importance to culture amongst the people here. The city is huge. There's infinite venues available. Production is cheaper than I've heard of it being anywhere else in the world. And there's like this really strong kind of anarchistic literati. Like there's super, super smart people here. And so here in this city, and also like everything's unpolished. It's not like New York where like every single abandoned space has been refurbished and rented out and is now like a small great gallery. Like there's like millions of fucking empty houses that are huge houses that could be amazing art venues. There's just like, there's empty spaces everywhere, and there's really smart people, and there's already a culture for art and for thinking and for kind of like revolutionary thinking. I think that every single condition that would birth and sustain a big international art movement exists here. And it's just a matter of time. And it's kind of like a matter of like people wanting to change also.
Okay. Por ejemplo, ahorita que estás diciendo todos los lugares abandonados, etc. ¿Tú has intentado encontrar lugares así para utilizarlos?
Uh-huh.
¿Y has tenido éxito?
Yes and no. You know, I have things in mind. I'm actually like, this year I'm starting as the director of like an independent residency and curatorial program. And so I'm gonna have to kind of like, I've been keeping in mind all of these places that I found, sorry. And now I have to start utilizing them.
Ok. Bueno, ya me has dicho que aquí sí has visto que hay como, que la gente sí empieza a hacer, se empieza a ayudar, pero entre ellos, ¿tratan de hacer una ruptura en el arte o se están enfocando solamente a crear lo que ya existe?
Exactly.
Es lo que has visto, que solamente se han enfocado a crear lo que existe, no han tratado de hacer la ruptura.
Yeah, but it seems to me like I've noticed a change. The end of last year, like amongst my contemporaries, we all started to get this idea collectively that we're kind of like sick of waiting for help from the older generations. We're sick of waiting for help from the institutions, and frankly, like we shouldn't be. And so with the conditions perfectly primed to explode, with all of these abandoned spaces, with all of these artists that don't have a voice, with all of these artists that are like connected to the internet and have this like really strong international dialogue happening and no venue to exhibit it here. Like I think this year, much more than last year, it's a totally different approach. I mean, I think that we're going to be seeing a lot more shows of people just having a show in their apartment, of people just like renting a space for a week and having a show. I think we're going to see tons of that shit. Because there's so many artists, and there's so few galleries, and there's so few independent spaces, and there's so few people taking chances. And the young artists are just fucking fed up, and I think that they're ready to like do it on their own.
Ok. Entonces digamos que aquí todavía están en progreso los artistas, están en su etapa de pubertad,
Mm-hmm.
o sea, tal cual. Lo que ahorita están en la parte del contestatario, del mentar madres, de lo que decías, ¿no? De pelear contra el sistema, todo eso. Entonces, lo único que falta, digamos que podría ser que en este año se empiece a dar la maduración de las nuevas generaciones de artistas y que empiecen a dar la ruptura que hace falta para que México se vuelva, lo que habéis dicho antes, ¿no? Un centro de arte ya internacional.
Mm-hmm.
O sea, porque México se ha sido catalogado como un centro cultural. ¿Por qué? Porque tiene historia, grandes museos, cultura impresionante, pero desde hace años. Pero no ha habido algo nuevo, o sea, no ha habido una ruptura tal cual. O sea, los grandes artistas mexicanos del último siglo han sido los más reconocidos que fueron los muralistas
Mm-hmm.
y algunas personas de la generación del surrealismo. Pero no hubo una ruptura, no hubo una creación de una vertiente aquí.
Well, there's like big artists, like mid-level artists in Mexico right now that are making tons of money off of the drug war and like making political artwork. I think that like the rupture that I'm interested in is breaking from that. I don't think it's helping culture at all. And well, I mean, what can I say? The internet's here. I mean, I think accessibility to books is really, honestly, really fucking shitty in Mexico. I think accessibility to books has like been a big thing. Like it's hard to kind of like educate yourself on what the rest of the world's doing because books are as expensive here as they are in New York, and people are making 1/10 of the money working, and so there's just no like accessibility to information. But now that everybody has the internet here, especially like in Mexico City, I'm speaking about specifically, like, and there's free information and everybody's soaking up like sponges. It's about time that like the generation of young artists, myself, and people younger than me, start utilizing all of these ideas that we've been taking on as a result of like the free proliferation of information.
En México es muy caro el acceso a la cultura,
Mm-hmm.
pero también en otras partes es igual de caro, hasta más. Por ejemplo, aquí un museo te sale en 100 pesos, 100, 150, cosas así. Pero por ejemplo, en Europa un museo te sale arriba de 10 euros.
Uh-huh.
Por ejemplo, el MoMA en cuanto está.
I think it's $20.
Exacto, no es nada barato.
No, but people are making 10 times more money.
Exacto. La otra es, por ejemplo, el Guggenheim, ¿en cuánto te sale la entrada?
It's the same.
Exacto.
They're all between 15 and 20 except for the Met.
Exacto. Y la otra es, por ejemplo, a mí me tocó una exposición en el Guggenheim que te la vendían como la gran obra de Kandinsky antes de ser reconocido. Entonces, bueno, pues quiero ver qué es lo que hizo él antes.
Ah.
Entonces, pero lo único que había de él eran 2 cuadros, todo lo demás era de su generación que estaban en la escuela.
Mm.
Entonces, eso es algo que ya se está haciendo en otras partes del mundo, que agarrar a los grandes artistas para empezar a reconocer a sus generaciones cuando ellos empezaron. Que aquí que es lo que se podría hacer desde ahora, ¿no? Utilizar a los nuevos artistas para empezar a crear esas generaciones.
Mm-hmm.
¿O tú cómo lo ves?
Yeah, I think so, but I think like it's gonna take more time until. I mean, there's a generation of kind of like 35 to 45-year-old people, and then there's an older generation with like Gabriel Orozco. He's kind of like out of vogue. Nobody gives a fuck about him anymore, or any of that generation. And like these guys that kind of came into fruition in the 90s, they have their establishment already. They have their apartments in Condesa. They're fine. And so like now it's just a matter of like the people of the next generation, my age and younger, or that are just coming out of the Esmeralda right now, to like start mobilizing and like talk about not only what is Mexico now. I think that that's like one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest pitfalls is that like this idea of making art as a Mexican instead of making art as a human. And I think that like with this kind of international culture exchange that the internet allows for, individuals start thinking of themselves as humans more and like nationalistic less, which is really good because a lot of the Mexican art that's being toured around Europe and museums right now is kind of like basically talking about how fucked up Mexico is and like creating a circus environment for people to come see the freak show of like the drug war in Mexico. And I don't think it's like a two-way street of conversation. And I don't think it contributes to art or it contributes to Mexico. It certainly contributes to the bank account of those artists that are doing it, and good for them, you know. But now I think that we're coming into a place that young Mexican artists can contribute and can contribute to the international dialogue of art that's happening. Not with like the pelo that I'm Mexican, but with the grand esteem that they're a human also, and that they're just as educated and they have like an interesting viewpoint and they can redefine things and push things in a different direction than other people could have.
Okay. A ver, ya, la última, para ver cómo lo podemos... Ya, con este caso. ¿Qué expectativa tienes tú? O sea, ¿cuál es tu expectativa de estar en este punto en México? O sea, en el que todo lo que me has contado, o sea, de que tú ya lo estás viendo como que va a ser un gran centro, que ahorita está en la parte de madurez, que se van a lograr las cosas. ¿Tú cómo te ves? O sea, ¿cuáles son tus expectativas?
What are my expectations for me, or for Mexico, or for the experience of being in Mexico?
No, las tuyas aquí, y de qué es lo que va a pasar mientras tú estés trabajando aquí también como artista, y qué es lo que se va a lograr como generacionalmente.
Well, I think that I already said that I think the strong suit of being an artist in Mexico is that there's no market, that you don't have to pander to the market. So you can make as pure, as raw, as unsellable work as you could possibly fucking imagine. You don't have to make a painting that fits inside of an Upper East Side apartment. You know, like there's no limitations for that. For me as an artist, like I've been going away from materials because in acknowledging that there's no market, I don't really have to be burdened by making things for a market. So I'm in a very unique and lucky position just to be as honest as possible through my material usage, through the art that I'm making, and I think that helps to give me a stronger perspective as to what my potential contributions to art could be, and it gives me a more like realistic view of myself. And I think it's important that like in lieu of kind of like this great American empire of fabrication art, like these giant grand museum shows with hundreds of thousands of dollars going into the production of that work, like there's no contextual justification for that kind of shit here. Like there's no justification for putting that much money into fabricating. And so going the opposite direction and like trying to get as cheap and as like down to the ground and as gritty and as pared down and as honest and as kind of like intellectually economical as possible is like a very unique position that I find myself in here that I'm really happy about, and I'm going to keep investigating in that direction.
Ya, con eso terminamos.
Well, no, I mean, I want to talk about what I think is going to happen for like the grander scheme in Mexico also, which is that like there are more residencies opening here. There are going to begin to be more independent spaces opening here. The dialogue is expanding. It's not staying between the drug war and modernism anymore. It's like every point in between. And I think that when the dialogue gets more vast and varied and dynamic is when Mexico is going to start getting real attention and really start contributing to like the larger conversation. And I think we're right around the corner from that happening.
Bueno, una más. Ves que cada generación siempre le ponen un nombre, que la última grande de artistas fue la posmodernidad.
Mm-hmm.
Durante todo este tiempo yo siempre he dicho que la posmodernidad ya murió, o sea, ya no existe. O sea, todos quieren seguirla manteniendo, pero ya no existe. Entonces yo los he resumido en que somos los hijos de la posmodernidad. ¿Tú crees que sea cierto? ¿O como hijos tenemos la posibilidad de crear algo más allá de lo posmoderno?
Well, I like the idea of postmodernity or post-structuralism, because I liked the idea of like how the internet was affecting the way we were all working and thinking, and that like the lineage, the historical line of art, the narrative has been broken by the internet. That I can access data from 2 billion years ago and combine it with an art show that I saw pictures of that I liked from 1980, and combine that from the book that I read from Spain from 1870, and like we have access to all points in history at the same time. We can put them together and kind of, I guess, in a way, create new narratives. And I don't really feel like that's been changed, and that's what I associate to post-structuralism. So I haven't necessarily come to terms with the idea of post-structuralism being dead, but I'm much more interested right now in just in making art that I don't know what it is, that I can't define, and I think that I'm more excited about that than I am about defining a bunch of shit. So I don't really give a fuck what the name of the new movement is. If I want to get put into it, that's fine. I mean, I'm like a contributing human right now in like what's happening in art. So I'm sure I might get thrown in there if I fucked the right curator or whatever.
Okay.
You know, but like I think it's I think it's much more exciting to be focusing on making things that like we don't know how to define right now, than like defining something so that we can fit inside of that place.
Ok. ¿Algo más que quieras para cerrar?
Thank you, man.